Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'm continuing with American Trade Unionism, Principles, Organization, Strategy, Tactics by William Z. Foster. This is Chapter 2, The Packinghouse Campaign. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, I was working as a car inspector on the Sioux Line in Chicago. For at the expiration of my year's term as business agent of the railway carmen sometime previous, I had refused the unanimous nomination of our 13 locals for a second term and had gone back to work on the road. While I inspected freight cars, I puzzled over what I might do to get some real organization work started. I felt quite helpless, I must say. Our ITUEL was gone, and there was I working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and consequently unable even to attend the meetings of the Chicago Federation of Labor, to which I was a delegate. Finally, however, one day as I was walking to work, and I remember well that it was July 11th, 1917, it struck me suddenly that perhaps we could get a campaign started to organize the workers in the great Chicago packing houses, whom the AFL had grossly neglected during many years. Except for the Teamsters, they were then totally unorganized, their conditions were frightful, and the demand for workers was strong, a splendid opportunity for an organizing campaign. Perhaps the progressive CFL could be induced to give its support. No sooner thought than done. That very night I took the matter up with the Chicago District Council of the Railway Carmen, which was led by former ITUEL militants. Our craft is a prominent one in the packing house situation, because the refrigerator car which we build is the basis of that industry, so the council readily endorsed my proposal. On the 13th, I was one of our committee to the meeting of the half-dead Local 87 of the bankrupt Butcher Workmen. We secured its reluctant endorsement, and on the 15th, the two unions introduced a resolution into the Chicago Federation of Labor calling for a joint organization campaign of all trades in the local packing industry. The CFL unanimously adopted our resolution. Thus, only 4 days after the plan was born, the campaign to organize the workers at the Great Packing Trust had got underway. From the outset, Joe Manley, Jack Johnstone, and other left-wing trade unionists were very active in this movement. On July 23rd, we formed the Stockyards Labor Council of a dozen local unions with jurisdiction over packing house workers, including butcher workmen, railway carmen, machinists, electricians, coopers, carpenters, office workers, steam fitters, engineers, firemen, etc. I was elected secretary and Martin Murphy, a rank-and-file butcher, president. Our working plan was that of a federation. We rejected the traditional left-wing policy of launching a new one big industrial union, as such a dual union would have split our forces and wrecked our movement at the outset. We decided to move towards industrial unionism by setting up an industrial federation and by locking the various component craft unions so firmly together under one council, one executive board, one set of business agents, etc., as to create a firm front in the whole industry. The workers accepted this industrial plan readily, as their big 1904 strike had been completely smashed because of disunity and union scabbing among the several craft unions organized in the two separate, jangling councils. We infused our whole movement with the spirit of industrial unionism. At the first meeting of the Stockyards Labor Council, we decided to base our movement primarily upon the unskilled masses, that is, the foreign-born and Negroes, who made up a majority of the workers. The Negroes, of whom there were 12,000 among the 60,000 Chicago packing house workers, presented a thorny problem. Many of the skilled crafts, despite our best efforts, barred them, although the main union, the Butcher Workmen, admitted them. To complicate matters, we faced the open hostility of the Negro middle-class elements, embittered by AFL discrimination. When we began our organization work, we proceeded upon the policy of taking the Negroes into the big mass Butcher Workmen local unions, and we thought that we had thereby solved the problem. But at once, the Negro leaders raised a shout that we were placing the Negroes into white unions, where they would be a helpless minority, and they demanded separate Negro unions. We naively agreed to this demand, whereupon, almost overnight, the cry of Jim Crow went along State Street with devastating effect. We eventually found a solution, however, by adopting the neighborhood principle, that is, by building mass unions in both Negro and white districts and having them open alike to Negroes and whites. This killed the Jim Crow issue and forced the corrupt elements among the Negro middle-class elements, agents of the packers, to come out openly against our organizing campaign generally and to advocate a policy of scabbing. Such a proposal was easy for us to beat, however, and the sequel showed that we finally won over the majority of the Negroes and built up the largest Negro trade union membership ever organized in any American city. But let me come back to the sequence of my story. Where were we to get organizers and money for our campaign? The AFL National Office gave us not a penny, and its local general organizer, Flood, was cynical and contemptuous. The ultra-reactionary butcher workman officials with a moribund union looked upon us as upstarts and dangerous rivals, and extended us nothing but hostility. The preliminary work was done mostly on a voluntary basis by Jack Johnstone, myself, and other former ITUEL militants. The CFL was friendly, but its initial financial help consisted in paying only the expenses of our first mass meeting. Upon the recommendations of the CFL and Railway Carmen's District Council, however, I was most reluctantly appointed by the Brotherhood of Railway Carmen of America General President Ryan as an organizer for a 90-day period. After we got well started and our movement looked promising, the CFL also put on Jack Johnstone as a paid organizer. Eventually, the Illinois Federation of Labor also gave us a couple of Negro organizers, and we scared up the help of occasional butcher workmen and other craft union business agents. Beyond this, the movement financed itself and produced its own organizers. John Fitzpatrick, president of the Chicago Federation of Labor, from the first was sympathetic to our campaign, but he was skeptical of its outcome, being afflicted with the prevailing pessimism in trade union circles to the effect that the Packinghouse workers were unorganizable. But as our campaign began to get results, he took a more active part, eventually becoming chairman of our national movement. His services were especially valuable in combating the disruptive tactics of reactionary AFL leaders and in carrying on the negotiations with the Packers and the government. An aggressive campaign. We launched our organization drive with great vigor and directed our efforts at the 5 great Chicago plants of the biggest packers of the huge beef trust. The workers came in large numbers to our meetings to listen, but, suspicious from long years of AFL betrayal and incompetence, few joined the unions. At the end of 6 weeks of intensive work, we had organized only 500 members. Fitzpatrick pronounced this result excellent, as no such showing had been made since the fatal strike of 13 years before. But to me, our progress was wholly unsatisfactory. The great packing industry could never be organized by such a one-by-one method. We simply had to find a way to start the workers into the unions en masse. Our little militant leading group was determined that at all costs the workers must be organized, and we were prepared to use drastic methods to this end. We were proceeding on a militant strike policy which had nothing in common with the Gompers' wartime no-strike program, and we were convinced that the workers were strike-minded and would respond to our efforts if they saw a prospect for strike action in support of the demands, 8-hour day, right to organize, etc., that we were popularizing. Hence, I proposed to our small leading committee a detailed plan whereby our 500 members, after good preparation and with the organized assistance of other industry militants, could be used to strike the great mass of 60,000 workers. It was a very risky move, but I'm still convinced it would have succeeded had we tried it. The organizers agreed with my proposals, but as we were getting ready, fortunately we were able to find a surer way to bring the masses into action by a strike movement. Under the influence of our Chicago campaign and the generally favorable situation, local organizations and strikes had begun to take shape in various Western packing centers. I therefore proposed the strategy of calling a national conference of Packinghouse workers to prepare demands to be made upon the packers. The leaders of the butcher workmen, typical AFL reactionaries, smelling a possible strike, strongly disagreed with this proposal, even as they violently condemned our whole militant line. But fearing to be swept aside by the rising mass movement, they finally grudgingly agreed. Whereupon, over their protests, we gave the story to the newspapers, stating that the move for a conference would probably culminate in a big national packing house strike. Next day, as I expected, the Chicago press bore great flaming headlines. Strike looms at yards. And so it was in other packing centers. The whole packing industry seethed over the threatening strike. The effect upon the discontented mass of workers was electrical. At last they saw the action they wanted, a chance to strike back at their exploiters. Then they fairly broke the doors down and joined in the Chicago unions in masses. The feeble stockyards organization grew wildly. For example, the decrepit Local 87 Butcher Workmen took in 1,400 members at its first meeting after the press announcement of the threatening strike. Likewise, the movement grew like a bay tree. In Sioux City, St. Louis, Fort Worth, Omaha, Kansas City, St. Joseph, St. Paul, Oklahoma City, Denver, and other big Western packing centers. Tens of thousands streamed into the AFFL locals. Our strategy had succeeded better even than we had anticipated. We were over the top in the organization of the great national packing industry, for years considered in trade union circles to be an utterly hopeless task. Meanwhile, we had joined the dozen cooperating Packinghouse unions together nationally into a loose committee, of which John Fitzpatrick was chairman and I secretary. However, the Packers had not been idle. At first, except for flooding our movement with spies, they had made no hostile move, evidently believing that our campaign, like so many AFFL drives in the past, would collapse of its own weight. But when they realized we were making real headway, they became alarmed and replied with the usual open-shop weapon of discharging active unionists. This discharge campaign spread far and reached its climax when Libby, McNeil, and Libby, a Swift subsidiary, fired some 50 of its Chicago workers. The policy of our militant organizers was to head towards a national strike of Packinghouse workers. We figured that only by such a strike could the workers fully secure their demands and establish their unions. We were also convinced that the Packers and the government never could stand a great Packinghouse strike in wartime, in view of the frantic demand for foodstuffs. So the Packers' provocations fitted right into our strategy, and we replied to Libby, McNeil, and Libby by quickly taking a national strike vote, which was almost 100% favorable. Then we began hasty preparation for a strike. But just at this juncture, the AFFL national leaders stepped in and steered the whole movement into the treacherous channels of a government mediation. The government comes to help the Packers. The Wilson administration, it will be remembered, to sidetrack the many strike movements and to prevent the extension of the trade unions into the open shop industries, had a policy of making government labor agreements for the duration of the war. Its Federal Mediation Commission was going about the country settling strikes on this basis. The AFFL leadership was, of course, in full harmony with this anti-union policy. Jack Johnstone, myself, and other Packinghouse militants were against such government interference. Fitzpatrick also opposed the government's entering, but he had no confidence in a strike, whereas the whole strategy of Johnstone and myself was based on the need for a strike to force the Packers by direct pressure to sign a union agreement. But the AFFL brought the government in spite of us. As a matter of routine, we formally notified the AFFL headquarters of our strike vote, whereupon, without notifying us, they promptly turned the matter over to the government. We were immediately infested with agents of the Federal Mediation Commission. Later, when I protested to Gompers about his bringing the government onto our necks, he lamely excused himself on the ground that he was not in his office when our telegram had arrived and that his secretary, Miss Lagarde, had referred it as a matter of course to the Department of Labor for mediation, an explanation which threw a bright light on the AFFL's wartime no-strike policy. This AFFL action upset our whole strike strategy. What was now to be done? Could we ignore the government mediators and strike anyhow? The cards were all stacked against such a course. The AFFL leaders would be solidly opposed to it, and so likewise would be the national officials of all the dozen federated unions in our joint movement. The great weakness of our Chicago Stockyards Labor Council, from first to last, was that, although it gave the whole stimulus and militant leadership to the national movement, the actual control of the international unions involved remained in the hands of the reactionary AFFL officials, and alas, we had no organized group of militants to link us up with the rank-and-file workers in the other packing centers. At about 18 months after this, in the 1919 steel campaign, we faced a somewhat similar situation. Our committee then confronted a demand from President Wilson, Gompers, and a large majority of the leaders of the 24 steel unions that we should sidetrack our developing strike movement and put our trust in government maneuverings. We were strongly organized enough to defy this treacherous demand, however, and to go on with the great national strike. But in the Packinghouse situation, with our new unions and our lack of national control, such a course would have been folly. So, yielding before superior forces, we had to enter, against our will, into the government mediation and to depend upon the growing strength and militancy of our movement to carry it on to victory in spite of its enemies, the Packers, the government, and the AFFL top leadership. The packing industry organized. After much jockeying around, we finally drew up an agreement with the Federal Mediation Commission in Chicago in December 1917, which provided for the right to organize, set up shop committees, present grievances, attend union conventions, etc. It further granted a 10% wage increase, the principle of seniority in employment, no discrimination because of creed, color, or nationality, display of peace work schedules, abolition of arbitrary discharge, abolition of compulsory benefit societies, establishment of proper dressing, lunch, and washrooms, etc. Our other 6 major demands then went to Federal Judge S. Altshuler, administrator of the packing industry, for arbitration decision. The National Packinghouse arbitration proceedings, held in Chicago early in 1918, were highly dramatic. The 5 big packers, Armour, Swift, Morris, Cudahy, and Wilson, were represented by attorneys Meyer and Condon, and the workers were represented by Frank P. Walsh and John Fitzpatrick. For 3.5 weeks, we paraded witnesses on the stand, workers, economists, labor leaders, including Gompers, giving publicity to the horrible workings and living conditions of the packing house workers and the fabulous profits being made by the packers, Armour himself admitting a war profit of $40 million in 1917. I must say that I took double pleasure in this exposure and discomfiture of the packers, for I personally had felt the lash of the hard conditions of the industry, having worked the winter of 1915 in the Swift & Company car shops for such miserable wages that I was too poor to buy an overcoat to shield me from the bitterly cold weather. On March 30th, 1918, Judge Altshuler handed down his award. With an eye on our militant movement and on the certainty of a national packing house strike in case of an unsatisfactory decision, he granted about 85% of the union's 6 demands. His award provided another 10% to 25% wage increase, a basic 8-hour day with 10 hours pay, extra time for overtime, equal pay for men and women doing the same class of work, a guarantee of 5 days work per week in slack seasons, and time off with pay for lunch periods and 8-hour shifts. The award was retroactive, the 125,000 workers of the big packers receiving $6 million in back pay, or an average of $40 per worker. With enthusiasm, the packing house workers greeted these terms as a great victory. They streamed into the unions all over the country and built solid organizations in every plant. Now our job of mopping up began. We made the hundreds of small packers sign the Altshuler Award, and then we carried the organization campaign into many subsidiary sections of the industry, such as retail butcher shops, the independent soap, washing powder, glue, canning, buttering, fertilizer, cooperage, etc. works. Besides this, many other local industries, such as machine shops, car works, etc., caught the contagion and were organized. In Chicago, we had dozens of strikes in this follow-up campaign. The most serious struggle was with the Union Stockyards and Transit Company. This powerful concern, owned by the great packers, received, fed, and distributed the tens of thousands of animals arriving daily at the Chicago yards. It is the nerve center of the local packing industry. Its autocratic head, Mr. Leonard, refused to sign the Altshuler Award, so he struck his 3,000 stock handlers on an hour's notice. Instantly, the transfer of all cattle, sheep, and hogs stopped. Frantically, the packers wired all over the West to halt the shipment of stock. Johnstone, Murphy, and I were summoned to the downtown Department of Justice office, where we were threatened with jail for obstructing the war. But we stood our ground and insisted that the U.S.&T. Co. come to the union's terms. Gradually, the huge packing houses, cut off from supplies of animals, came to a standstill. The menace of a great packing house strike loomed. But after a few days, the U.S.&T. Co. weakened and signed on the dotted line. It was a real victory, and the oppressed packing house workers were jubilant. The great stockyard organization's campaign had by now achieved its major goal. The industry was thoroughly organized all over the country from top to bottom. More than 200,000 workers had come into the dozen federated unions. These included unskilled as well as skilled, immigrant workers and native-born, and fully 25,000 of the new members were Negroes. Many office employees also joined the organization, and even the stockyards policemen formed a union. At last, the autocratic packers were compelled to meet with the workers and talk business with them, and especially they did not relish conferring with Johnstone and me. The packing house victory marked a new high stage in American labor organization. It was the first mass production, trustified industry ever to be organized by the trade unions. And the victory was doubly significant in that it was accomplished by militant policies and on application of the industrial union principle, at least in a modified form. But of course, the reactionary AFL bureaucracy learned nothing constructive from all of this. For us former ITUEL militants, the campaign had a very special significance. It was a glowing justification of our policy of working with the old trade unions. And it also showed what could be done on our theory of organizing the unorganized millions by militantly taking advantage of the war situation. The aftermath in the packing industry. It turned out that soon after Judge Altshuler's decision, I left the packing industry to take up the big steel organizing campaign. But I cannot go on with that until I tell how the splendid organization of the Packinghouse workers was eventually destroyed by the Packers, with effective assistance by the AFL leaders. It is one of the most shameful stories of betrayals in American labor history. From the outset of 1917, the Gompersite officials of the Butcher Workmen, headed by Dennis Lane, a stockholder in a local packing company, did everything possible to sabotage the organizing campaign. Their aim was to destroy the Stockyards Labor Council with its splendid solidarity and its militant leadership. They wanted to wipe out its industrial union trend and re-establish the old discredited craft system, so they fought to cut off its per capita tax from the locals. They demanded that each local have its own business agent instead of our centralized system. They insisted that there be formed a second council, that is, a packing trade council of butcher workmen locals only. That was the fatal two-council system that had destroyed the 1904 strike and which, at the beginning of the Stockyards campaign, we had pledged ourselves never to reintroduce. They flooded the Chicago locals with organizers who, supported by every Packer spy and stool pigeon, fought for this splitting program. It was in the face of such disruptive tactics that we had to go on with our organizing work. The fight became very bitter. Finally, Lane's crowd, in alliance with the notorious Simon O'Donnell gang of building trade thugs, decided to take over the Stockyards Labor Council by strong-arm methods. As an entering wedge, they tried to force us to seat one of their thugs as a delegate. We refused, and for this I was slated to be rubbed out, the notorious gunman Big Tom Murphy openly threatening me. However, we were not helpless, and we let it be known that if any rough stuff were tried, we would know whom to reach and how. The Lane O'Donnell plan fell through, and we remained in full control. In the first year after I left the packing industry, the fight grew still more bitter. 2 organizers were killed. My successor as secretary of the SLC, Jack Johnstone, one time, gun in hand, shot it out successfully with a gang of Lane's armed raiders who tried to seize the headquarters by force. Lane, who controlled the official butcher workman union machinery outside of Chicago, our weak spot all along, finally organized a Chicago Packing Trades Council. Only about 2,000 members joined it. He thereupon expelled 40,000 of his union's members who have remained affiliated to the Stockyards Labor Council. The Chicago Federation of Labor protested against this outrage but was warned by Gompers to keep its hands off. Then other AFL union officials in the packing industry set to work to help Lane split up the Packinghouse workers and destroy the industrial solidarity that had been the key to the great success of the movement. Finally, there were 3 councils, the Packing Trades Council, the Mechanical Trades Council, and the Stockyards Labor Council. Besides, there were several unattached locals and large numbers of unorganized workers, demoralized by the AFL treachery. Similar disruptive tactics were used in other packing centers. This went on for 2.5 years after our big victory in 1918. By the fall of 1920, the former splendid organization was much weakened. So the Packers, in step with the great post-war open shop offensive of the time against organized labor, set up company unions, slashed wages, and broke off all relations with the unions. The workers replied to these attacks by a national Packinghouse strike on December 5, 1920. But though they fought heroically, they were defeated and their organization almost completely wiped out, a victim of the reactionary policies of the AFL. If the Greens and Hutchisons of today wish to know one of the many reasons why the workers in the basic industries want no more of craft unions and are a demanding industrial organization, let them observe the tragedy of the Packinghouse 1917 to 1921 movement. From meat packing to steel. But let us come back to the events of 1918, with our theory that the main task was the organization of the millions into the trade unions, and that at all costs the wartime demand for workers must be utilized to this end. We naturally sought to use the big victory in the packing industry as a point of departure for a new organization drive. I had no idea of settling down as a trade union official in the packing industry. After considerable thought, I decided to make a try at steel. The trade unions had conquered their first trustified industry, meat packing, and I was confident that, if they would only better themselves a bit, they could also win out in the greatest of all trustified industries, steel. Therefore, even before Judge Altshuler had handed down his arbitration decision, being sure that he must grant most of our demands, I had written a resolution to have the Chicago Federation of Labor call upon the AFL to initiate a national organizing campaign in the steel industry, along the general lines that had proved so successful in meatpacking. However, for a couple of weeks I did not introduce the resolution into the CFL because of a curious reason. During our arbitration, the Packers' lawyer, Condon, had dramatically declared that if Altshuler conceded our demands, it would create a vast upheaval among workers in industry generally, and that millions of them would go marching into the bosses to make similar demands. Even as he was saying this, I had in my pockets the proposed steel campaign resolution. So fearing that its introduction into the CFFL might seem to Altshuler too much like Condon's prophecy coming true and thereby adversely affect his decision, I had to withhold it until after the judge's award. Finally, on April 7, 1918, a week after Altshuler's decision, I introduced the resolution into the CFFL, signed by the railway carmen and a dozen other metal trade unions. It called for a nationwide AFFL joint campaign of all the unions having jurisdiction over workers in the steel industry. It was based on a broad industrial movement, from the coal and iron miners and the lake transport workers all through the industry to the men doing the last phases of finishing in the fabricating division of the steel industry and those who hauled the final products out onto the railroad main lines. Such a federated movement, as in the packing industry, was the most practical approach to be made to the necessary industrial form. The CFFL adopted the resolution unanimously, and the Great Steel Campaign was on. 1936. That is the end of Chapter 2. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Hope you all enjoyed. Have a good day.